Hello everyone, in this video you are going to be able to create tree diagrams and two-way tables. Tree diagrams and two-way tables are really useful tools in probability to help us list out an event, to view a sample space, or to find out some probabilities. I'll start with a tree diagram. A tree diagram looks like, as you might expect, it is a tree, kind of ends up being a tree with different branches. I'm going to use an example today to help us explain these two different things. And it's going to be flip a coin twice. So picture you have a coin and we're going to be flipping it twice. So you start off with your coin. It's got two sides. It has a heads and a tails. So you can use your tree diagram, which is the one I'm doing first, to represent this scenario, this event. So I flip my coin. There's two options. So I have two branches. The first option is a heads. So that's at the end of one branch. The second option is a tails. That's at the end of the second branch. If I then flip this coin again, a second time, if I get a heads first, and I flip it again, I have two options. It can either be a heads or a tails. And if I get a tails in the first flip, I do it again, I can either get a heads or a tails. So as you can see in my tree diagram, the branches are expanding out to show you every possible outcome that can happen from this event. Why this is really useful is, this example isn't too hard. There's only flipping a coin twice. But what happens if it was a really quite a complex example? There were lots of different steps you were doing. This can help you map it out. One thing you can do is at the end of your tree diagram, if you follow each branch, you actually will find all of the possible outcomes of this event. So let me look at if I got a heads the first time and heads the second time. Well, you would write it like heads, comma, heads. That is one outcome of this event. Another outcome might be you get a heads and a tails. Another outcome might be you get a tails and a heads. And the last outcome will be you get two tails. You might recognize that this is our sample space. These are the four possible outcomes of flipping a coin and getting heads. So this is a really useful way of following down and writing your different events and how to find your sample space from using a tree diagram. Sometimes on tree diagrams we'll write the probability of each of these events happening. So I'm writing a half on the top of each of these branches because it's a half chance of being a heads and half a chance of being a tails. And likewise down the second coin flip, you have a 1 out of 2 or a 50% chance of it being a heads or a tails. So this is a tree diagram. From a tree diagram, you can take quite useful information, such as finding a sample space, or perhaps we're doing something a little bit different, like you want to find the probability of flipping a coin twice and getting two tails. Well, looking at our sample space, this one here has two tails, it's a 1, and there are 4 different outcomes, so it's 1 in 4. But we'll cover that in more detail another time. Excuse me. For now, if you understand how to create a tree diagram from a simple example such as flipping a coin twice, and you understand how to write down the sample space, you're doing a really excellent job. So that's a tree diagram. The next thing I wanted to talk about was a two-way table. So let's have a look at this grid here. There's 9 different boxes. I'm going to use this same example, and the example was flipping a coin twice. So down the first row in the first column, I'm going to write down the 2 different options. So if I flip it the first time, it could be a heads or a tails. If I flip it a second time, it could be, I might change color here, I'll use blue for the second time, it could be a heads or a tails. What you do in a two-way table, you can represent these 2 events, flipping the coin, once for the black one and once for the blue one, and you can represent the sample space in the same way we represented it at the end of our tree diagram. We can represent our sample space in our two-way table. The way you do that is, say for instance you get a head for the first one, the first coin flip, it's heads, and for the second coin flip, you get another heads. So here's one outcome, you can get 2 heads. Well, maybe you get a heads on the first one, and the second one is a tails. Here's another outcome. And I can go through and list out tails for the first one, heads for the second one. I can list out my entire sample space. And if you've done it correctly, you will find that your sample space for your two-way table is on the inside. So you've got heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, tails, tails. If I compare that back with my tree diagram, it's the same here. Here's my sample space. So those are two extremely useful tools for helping you list out a sample space or to figure out what your probabilities are or what your outcomes are from using a tree diagram and a two-way table. I hope you found this interesting and you've learned something new.